Hey, Rachel, thanks so much for joining me today to talk about the emotional side of private practice. Before we jump in, I would love to know more about your journey to becoming a private practice consultant.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here today. And the road to starting my consulting company, Next Level Private Practice, was, I would say, really because of two things. And one of those things was I own a group practice. And as I was building my group practice, or as we were growing and expanding in number, um, we became a large number, but we didn't have the infrastructure to support a large number of therapists. And there were reasons, there were parts involved in why I did it that way. But I realized, okay, now we have to go backwards and we have to build all this infrastructure. And so part of my consulting work is helping other practice owners build that infrastructure before they grow into a bigger entity. Just a lot more effective, a lot less painful. So that was definitely one of the reasons that I started the consulting company. The second reason that I really decided to start the consulting practice or consulting company is because after we became a larger group practice, because I had developed a lot of relationships in my own community with other practice owners and other therapists, and I just sort of organically had a lot of people coming to me and asking me questions about various aspects of developing my practice. What's your hiring process? And what about this whole billing and credentialing piece? And "Can I pick your brain and meet you for coffee?" was, like, a common question, and I was doing a lot of these coffee meetings and realized at one point that I really had to put some boundaries around the advice, and the expertise that I was sharing, and so that really was another reason that I created Next Level, just to set some of those boundaries and decide what offerings and what kind of work I was actually gonna do in consulting because I was already sort of unofficially doing it. So that was another reason that Next Level was born.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Sort of kind of like the path of building out your own practice, the obstacles that you faced, kind of leading into you needing to solve those obstacles, and then also being like, hey, wait, now this journey that I've been on to build this thing is actually being noticed by other clinicians, and I'm getting asked for advice. So let's turn this into a consultancy.
Yes, I mean, that's really it wasn't, planned from the beginning or anything, but because I was already doing it, I thought, "Well, I wanna do this well, and I really wanna define what kind of work I wanna do," and so, yeah, essentially, that sort of pushed me to really develop Next Level and, like, what it would become. Mhm.
That's awesome. Yeah, and along the way, it feels like because I've known you for years, and seen your journey and some of your, things that you've been working on, and something that we talked about often is, like, the emotional side too, so it's
Mhm.
interesting because you have that perspective of the emotional side from how you like, what you went through, but then now you also have that as a consultant, like, you've witnessed so many other therapists building their practices as well. Do you have,
Yes.
like, perspective on what are the common emotional blocks that come up for therapists?
So, yes, and I can generalize this in that, like, I have seen this within my own self or my own system and also with many others. I think there are some commonalities. I know that we're not all exactly the same, but the way that I look at this or view this question is really in terms of the idea that we all have parts. And the idea that we all have parts really comes from internal family systems or the IFS model, although there are other models that talk about parts. But if we sort of consider, hey, we all have parts or these sub personalities that exist within our systems, and they often will be activated and come up sometimes really fiercely and try to protect us. If we think about this in that frame, we all have parts, they want to protect us. Um, Thinking about that frame first, and then second, sort of thinking about my journey and the journey of many that I've worked with, some of the common parts that I think we have in our systems as therapists, business owners. for me, one of the first things that I noticed most, as I grew the practice was sort of this idea of this people pleaser part. So this part that wanted to make everyone happy, didn't want anyone to be upset, and of course, this can show up in the clinical work with clients, but it also really showed up for me as I hired clinicians. And it didn't seem that no matter what I did, that I could make everyone happy, but wow, did I really try. And it really led me to some burnout. And I did realize at some point that there was no way that that was possible, but this people pleaser was really in action. And I definitely see this when I work with other therapist business owners, this idea that, well, I don't want to upset anyone. I don't want to like set any of these rules or enact any of these policies or hold folks accountable because they'll get upset, they'll get mad. Maybe they'll leave, maybe they'll trash my business, maybe they'll give me a bad Google
Mhm.
review. So there's a lot of fear around if we displease people. So that's a tough one. I know many therapists sort of carry, and I think that many women, carry sort of a stronger people pleaser part. And, the the people pleaser part in my system, there's a close cousin part that's like, we need to save the world. Like, I feel like these 2 parts sort of ping off each other for me at least, and for others that I've worked with. So if we believe some people will call this like the bleeding heart, right? Like we have to save the world, we have to fix everything. And this we have to save the world part was really instrumental in when the pandemic hit in 2020, our group practice was 4 or 5 clinicians. And when the mental health world blew up during the pandemic and the need got so high, this part was like, we have to hire more clinicians. We have to help more people. We can't leave all these people in crisis because this group of 4 or 5 clinicians in my group, we could only see so many people. So this part was really instrumental in us growing in numbers, which we did help a lot of people, but again, we sort of got to this point where we are this large group without the infrastructure to support it. So it wasn't the right way to go about it, but this part was at the helm of that. And that connection to the people pleaser, like we need to make everyone happy, we need to help, we need to fix. As a business owner, that can really sometimes get in the way. And it can, for some business owners, I've actually seen this tank the business or put the business out of business if things sort of go on too long and get too extreme. So wanting to save the world and wanting to please everyone doesn't always show up in the best ways in business. Um, And a few other common parts that I definitely experience and other folks that I've worked with in consulting experience are, we know we may call this imposter syndrome. I self-doubt essentially, and the way that that shows up, especially when we have to take risks as business owners, when we have to do things that we don't know how to do at all, like insurance billing is a good example, right? This is a big fear point for a lot of therapists. So when we're in situations where we don't feel like we know what we're doing at all, that imposter, that self-doubt comes up. And it typically is connected to a really critical element in our system that in IFS we call the inner critic. So the inner critic will come up and just bash and say horrendous things when we fail or try to stop us from taking risks. And wow, like that was really profound for me in the beginning when I was building my practice. That inner critic was pretty relentless and stopped me in my tracks many times. And heard very similar stories from others that have been in this position of being a therapist that wants to start a business. So I think that inner critic, I think we all have an inner critic. It may sound and show up a little bit different, but I think that we all have one. Um, Now I have to, like every time I say this part and then this part's connected to this part. So for me, the inner critic will often sort of ping or activate the perfectionist part. The perfectionist part is,
Mhm.
well, we can't do anything unless it's perfect. We can't We can't post on social media unless the words are perfect. We can't go into a session with a client unless we know exactly how to respond to them. There's so many ways perfectionism shows up. And when you're running a business, it's sort of another, well, this thing has to be perfect before we can say enact a change in the practice, or um, we have to hire the perfect therapist, right? Or we don't hire at all, right? So perfectionism can really like show up in profound ways as well. And for me, my perfectionist part can get really intense, and I've seen this in others as well, and almost like send me into like an overdrive state where I'm working lots of hours. I may be not taking care of myself. I may not be sleeping as much as I should, eating as much as I should. So the perfectionist part can get very, very intense. And it's managerial in nature. Like it's the doer, it's the tasker, it's the let's make the list and do the list perfectly. Let's not stop until everything is done, until everyone's happy. Right. So that perfectionist part, or those managerial parts that can really bring a lot of intensity to our system, kind of rev us up really high. The thing about that is we can't sustain that. None of us can sustain that in our systems. And so I don't know that I've ever worked with another therapist business owner that doesn't have the perfectionist part elements that send them into sort of this overdrive state. But what happens in our systems is we can't sustain it, and so we have to sort of crash and burn, or we have to take a break from that intensity in some sort of way. For me personally, the other side of the intensity is shutdown, or clinically we may call this dissociative or dissociation. Um, when I really meet with this part, it's just for me, I describe it as a blankness. It's just a blankness. It takes me out. I could be sitting in front of the TV and have no idea what just happened for the last hour on the TV. I could just be scrolling on my phone. So that blankness takes me out because I can't be in the intensity anymore. And we like when we're in the intensity, the other side of the intensity looks different for different folks. We may get angry, we may get really like avoidant and want to just run away and stop stop the process completely. So there are different ways that our parts can show up on the other side of this intensity, but sometimes it can feel extreme in our systems. Like we're revved up, we're really intense, and then all of a sudden we've crashed and burned, and however that shows up. So that can show up in a lot of different ways. It can also show up in addictive process, like things that we do that just make us feel, help us check out, help us be on the other side of the intensity. So it shows up differently for all of us, and really the same sometimes for all of us, including business owners, including therapists. So those are some of the common parts in my system and in others that I've worked with. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think what struck me is that it seems like there's a lot of what I would call borrowing from polyvagal theory, like the sympathetic activation. So it's like these doing parts and pleasing parts and saving parts. And then there's also those dorsal parts where it's like the shutdown and like, okay, this is like the complete overwhelm, just turning everything off because you can't sustain that sympathetic state forever.
Yeah,
Um,
you can't.
yeah.
Yeah. So it can show up a little bit differently in different systems, but it typically is like just you said, like you could map it out. It might look a little different between you and I, but you can map out, okay, here's what's sort of happening in this person's system right now
Yeah.
when we become activated, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you find trends around what situations are activating, or is that a little bit different for everyone? Because in my work, I'll give also some context because I'm working every day with therapists on their marketing, and that's also kind of into the sales, and so I see a lot of protective parts in the way that therapists show up in their marketing too, and I
Mhm.
think that it's pretty dysregulating to do marketing and sales as a therapist.
Yes.
Um, so, like, I already kind of have that one in mind, but, you have such a broad perspective of all of the clinical side, the practice management, group practice, managing other clinicians. Do you see a trend around, like, what throws people out of their tolerance?
Well, I mean, I think it does depend on the person's system. I think
Yeah,
the idea of, like, walking through the muck, we have no idea what we're doing is extremely activating. When we try something and fail, it's extremely activating.
yeah,
But sort of like if we were actually in IFS therapy right now, like, yes, we would map out these different parts that show up that are protecting us, but then eventually we would get curious about, well, what are these parts actually protecting us from? Right? And that's sort of the parts that sort of carry the wounding and the trauma and the hard experience. Sort of, I call these like the under the ground, under the dirt, buried sort of deep parts of us because they don't really get to come out and play very much because the protectors make sure that we never experience them. So the reason I can't say with certainty is because usually these more like traumatized or pain parts in the system, they're connected to like hard experiences from the past. And so um that's different for all of us, right? But what I always try to help people get curious about is, for example, if you're engaging in sales and marketing, and let's say that you put an offer out there and no one buys it, what comes up for you? Oh, I failed. I'm terrible. I'm awful. I'm horrible. Okay, but what does it mean if you failed? Right. And then we get into sort of the deeper, well, if I fail, it means this is different for everybody. It means that I am worthless, for example. Right. And we know like logically that if we fail, it doesn't mean we're worthless. But that's sort of the tie back to the past and what the parts believe. The parts are like, here we are again in this really vulnerable state of failing, and we might be right back where we were back then. So because our parts don't necessarily know what's happening today. So a lot of this is what is tied to past experience. If that I know that's not a really specific
yeah,
answer, but that's
yeah,
sort of like the deeper work of IFS, right? Like we can definitely identify the parts, but the deeper work is, but what are they protecting us from? And we have to go down and heal the parts that are harmed and hurt and that carry all these in EMDR, we would say negative core beliefs, right? So and that's probably in your experience in working with therapists, they may not all respond the very same way if they fail or if they feel vulnerable, but there's something down in the dirt under there that means something really awful if they don't succeed. Yeah.
yeah,
In our example, yeah.
yeah. No, that makes total sense. Lots of opportunities for activation then in building a business.
Yes, and it's not always like people can't always say, "Oh, the reason I feel so activated right now is because if I fail, it means deep down that I'm worthless because I have this part that carries the worthlessness that's tied to all these experiences." Like we're we're not gonna like realize all of that is happening in our system and what's connected to what necessarily, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it just goes a lot deeper typically. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that kind of leads into something else I'm super curious to hear about, which is like, what have you seen actually help therapists with these types of challenges? So, as you said, there might be a different, depending on the therapist and depending on the situation too, I would imagine
Mhm.
there's a different level of consciousness of what is even going on, like your ability to witness in the moment, or even, just after something passes, like, oh, why was I so grumpy on Monday? That
Yeah, like
actually
what
just
was
happened
that?
to me. Yeah, that happened to me recently where it's like like something happened, I like felt terrible and I couldn't really figure out why for like a day or two later, and then I was like, "Oh, okay," like, almost like you have to get sometimes I feel like I have to get dysregulate or, like, less regulated or dysregulated. No, I have to get regulated in
Yeah,
order
yeah.
in order to even have the capacity to see that happening.
Right, to see what happened, yeah. No, and
But,
that
like,
makes perfect sense. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Well, so the idea of like, well, what do we do in these like in parts language when these parts sort of take over? Because like what you just described, like a part could sort of be running the show in those moments when you felt grumpy, but in the moment, if the part is sort of leading, you don't have that awareness. You're not like, there's a grumpy part leading me right now, right?
Yeah.
You feel all this activation and you might say or do things and later go, "What was that about? That's not me. I don't usually like, yell at my dog or, like whatever happens when we're grumpy." And so it often takes, okay, now I'm in a more regulated place and now I can get more curious about what happened there, right? So that's just like such a common thing. And even when we're doing all of this deep healing work, like we're doing, say, like a therapy like IFS, we're still going to get activated and our parts are still going to take over sometimes. It's not, the goal is never, we're completely regulated in every moment, right? Like that's not even possible. So that's someone's perfectionist part that says, can you look at my treatment plan? I'll be 100% regulated. No, I won't do that because that's not realistic. But what I'll typically say as a therapist and as a consultant is the way to, I guess, manage these parts a little more so that they don't like take over and aren't like the part of me that took over that turned my group into a 40 therapist group. Um, Again, I had some say in that, but that part was at the helm for quite a while, right? As I grew the group and all the crisis of the pandemic. And so what I'll typically say is, well, what we're going to have to do is just really build relationships with these parts. We're really going to have to get to know these parts. We're going to have to befriend these parts. And sometimes I'll joke, have dinner with these parts sometimes, right? When they come around, when we notice them, we really have to get to know them and build relationship, which is a really different idea than some of the therapy models that say, well, let's learn how to cope. Let's learn how to like bring them down when they get really high. Or if the fire is burning really high, we have to figure out how to distinguish the fire. I remember starting in my IFS therapy and saying to my therapist, well, can I just kick this part out of the system? I don't like it. I don't want it. Right. So in some ways, we're taught to sort of like avoid the parts or try to dismantle them or shut them up or quiet them down. But in reality, we have to get to know them, um, and really learn as much as we can and get really curious. Like, what happens in my system? In your example, when that grumpiness is around, how do I know grumpiness is starting to sort of creep in, right? Because we'll feel things in our physical body, we may have like sensations, we may have a narrative in our head, right? My inner critic that is like, if you try this thing and you fail one more time, right? So starting to become really aware of how these parts show up and really starting to build relationship with them is the best way that I have found to try to like regulate the system. And in IFS, we talk about regulation as being in self or having self energy. So like self is who we are very authentically. It's how we show up and who we want to be. And then the parts come up and can knock us right out of that sort of self, the idea of self. And so we want to try to have as much access to self as we can, but we're not going to do that by batting the parts away. We're going to do that by self and part having relationship with each other. I'm trying not to get too clinical, but that's just like sort of the way that I see
Yeah.
it, explain it to
Yeah.
folks. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if you could share, like, what is a practical way to do that? Like, I think because what you're saying is that instead of, saying, "Hey, perfectionism, you suck," like, "I never wanna feel that way again," or like,
Like,
"Get
"Shut
out of
up."
here." Yeah, "Shut up, you're not welcome here." So instead of saying that to my perfectionistic part, what would be a practical thing? Is it just like affirmations or like, like with my example, I couldn't tell what was going on for me until I got more regulated. So maybe
Yeah,
when I'm more regulated, is there something that I can do?
yeah.
Or is this really like more a question also of like maybe deeper work too? Like,
Well, yeah, I
Like
mean,
getting in that dirt level that you're talking about?
yeah, I mean, the dirt level, I guess, is ideal for sort of what we think about as like holistic healing of our systems. But if we're not able to do that, or we don't have access to something like IFS, I would say that it's also very beneficial for our systems just to build the awareness around those parts and start to really identify them. So, like in your example of, okay, a couple days later, I was feeling more regulated. Okay, let me think back. Can I remember what sensations I was feeling? Can I remember if there were a voice in my head with that grumpy part? What can I recall about how I felt and what I thought when that part was leading my system, right? Um, and sometimes I'll say to folks like, you don't have to be an artist to do this, but like jot like have a journal, have a notebook and jot some things down. Okay, I noticed when I start to feel grumpy, I always have these words that are like, you really suck. I don't know what they are, but like
Yeah.
starting to become aware of like when this part comes around, here's how it shows up. And when we externalize it in some way, capturing it on paper, capturing it on computer by typing, drawing it, there's so many different ways we can externalize, but once we externalize and get it out of our head and outside somehow, that starts to build awareness. So like the next time that part comes around, if you've externalized it, you're it's gonna sort of ping in your brain. You're gonna go, wait a minute, that narrative's in my head, grumpy's around again.
Yeah.
So it's like, in IFS, we call this mapping. We're mapping the parts out externally in some sort of way so that we just become, because we'll become more and more aware. And once we're aware, it's sort of like that idea where we can intercept the part before it completely takes over. So like if you notice Grumpy sort of coming forward, and like when Grumpy's around, I feel like a weight on my chest, for example, you can go right to that sensation in your body and go, hey, like you can actually talk to it. And I know this sounds a little bit wild, but it does work. Hey, I know you're around. Maybe you're afraid of something right now. I want you to know I'm here. You're not alone. It's really like the way that like a parent would comfort a child, maybe, right? A lot of our parts are younger in nature and they don't have like the logic and the resources that we have as self-led adults. So affirmations, sure, but just telling this part, like if this part's really afraid if they don't come forward, this bad thing will happen, you can say, I'm here and I'm going to lead us. And you know what? Something bad might happen, but I am going to be able to help us get through the bad thing. So that's like so different than this part just taking over and like doing its thing, right? So even externalizing and building awareness will help us to start build those relationships, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it totally makes sense. It kind of reminds me of, practices that are taking you into the seat of the observer
Yeah.
rather than, just being in it. So
Yeah.
that you can have that like compassion and care for yourself.
Well, yeah, because you have the part has to give you enough space. So like self and part can be there together, but sometimes the part doesn't allow any space for self. They just like take over and they start. Also use this analogy that sometimes it's helpful that hopefully like we're on a school bus, hopefully us, our authentic self is driving, and then our parts are all behind us, on the bus seats. And there are going to be times where they get activated and they kind of walk up to the front and go, look, I'm driving, and try to kick self out of the drive seat. But the awareness of, uh-oh, like these three parts just got up and they're walking up to the front right now, or maybe one or more parts. Sometimes there is more than one that wants to drive, and us just being aware and like sensing that they're coming to the front and being able to say, hey, I know y'all are freaked out right now, but I'm going to continue to drive us. You all can stay close to me and you can observe what happens, but I'm going to continue to drive us. And that's really us having just so much more choice in our own systems in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can see how that this sort of practice would care for those challenges that are coming up in these contexts of building a practice. And like what I was saying with marketing and sales as well, where if you're in the driver's if yourself is in the driver's seat, your authentic self, the one that knows that, you're not worthless, or, you don't have to get into that inner critic voice or perfectionism,
Mhm.
then you can, yeah, just show up with more ability to navigate the choices of private practicing.
Yeah, well, and things are gonna go wrong. I know,
Yeah.
like, I've had a client say to me before, because I've been talking directly to her part and saying something like, I said my self-energy I was trying to send my self-energy to say, "Hey, we all fail. We are going to fail. There isn't any way around failure," and this part came right back and said, "That is not acceptable." Right? Okay, well, parts can get really rigid, parts can get really black and white. When we get into really black and white sort of thinking, typically a part is leading or a part is blending with us. And so we both know logically that we are going to fail. But what does it mean when we fail? Right. And
Mm,
that's the deeper work. But just even being aware of, oh, this part is coming up to protect me from failure, I can reassure that part when it comes to the front of the bus. We are going to fail. And you know what? I'm going to be able to tolerate and handle that failure because I am this old of an adult. I have accomplished this many things. Here are the letters behind my name, right? Because sometimes parts need updates. They don't
yeah.
know that they don't know how far we've come often because they're often stuck back in the times and places where we experienced hard things. So they need updates.
Yeah,
They need
totally.
updates as well. Yeah, yeah.
Oh man, I love this. I feel like we've talked a bit about the things that someone could do on their own,
Yeah,
but I know that you have a private practice summit coming up this year,
yeah,
and separately outside of this call, we've been talking about how healing that is to be like in community, also to kind of overcome this. Can you say more about that? Because I think it wasn't just community, but, like, how can something like the summit help, practice owners kind of, yeah, face these challenges that are coming up?
yeah. So my idea, I've had the idea of having this private practice summit for the last, I don't know, 2 or 3 years, and my original idea was, wow, like, what if we actually had a place where private practice people come together, they do build community, connection with each other, which connection is healing in itself, where they can build new relationships and network, which I know sometimes when we say the word network, people are like, ew, network. That word is activating to people. But having that platform to not only connect and network, but also just to learn, right? Because we're going to have around 30 speakers and we're going to be looking at the clinical and the business sides of private practice. We're going to try to be looking at both of those because often in conferences, we're focused on one aspect or the other. We don't often bring both sides of private practice together. So I thought, well, for me personally, I want the connection and the community, and I want the relationships, and I want to know who else is out there because it is being a practice owner is very isolating, and we're often very siloed. And in some aspects, we're kind of taught to be that way, and I don't like that, so I've really been working for the last several years to try to network and bring private practice folks together, and I think that this summit is one of the ultimate ways to do that. Um, when we think about self-energy or being in self, there are a lot of in IFS, we have the 8 C's of self. There are a lot of elements, and one of them we've talked about is curiosity and compassion. There are 8 of those C's, but one of those C's is connection. And I do think that through connection, there is healing, and through connection, there is like more access to self. And the more access we have to self, like we talked about, the more we can move forward in developing our businesses and in our clinical practice as well. So I'm just really excited. And I like me personally, I'm like, I can't wait to connect with these other practice owners. Um, but we have the learning and we have the new perspective. I'm trying to sort of make this summit a little something for everyone. But I really personally want the connection and the community building aspect of it. If that,
Yeah,
yeah,
I love that. the community, the connection, and it's so interesting that that is also part of IFS, the connection, being like a literal self energy within yourself, but also now you're bringing that into like the actual private practice summit too.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah,
And I'm hopeful. I know that, I'm hopeful that people will, and but I know that they will because in these other spaces, feel that connection because in other spaces, another reason I created this is I have sort of done my share of going to retreats and conferences and summits and trying to really get to know other practice owners and other therapists too that do similar clinical work. And every time I'm in these spaces, I meet cool people, I build these relationships, I feel less isolated, I feel less alone. And so creating something like this, I know that I'm certain that people will be able to feel that energy and get some value out of just the connection piece alone. I mean, I'm pretty certain of that because I always get that. Like I like to learn new things, but also like that connection for me is just so profound.
yeah,
Yeah.
I love that.
Mhm.
So before we sign off, where can people find out more about your consultancy and also the summit too?
Yeah, so just one easy way is just to go to nextlevelprivatepractice.com. The summit is right there on the main page at the top, and along with all of the other offerings or things that I do in Next Level to help practice owners. So everything is there right on that main page to check out. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for our talk today.
Yes, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. See you. Bye.
Bye.